playing.
Yeah, this is, if you're not familiar with the strategy, it's totally off the beaten path. The idea here is to use the Cascade cards from the Shards of Alara block, but there's nothing in the deck that costs less than 3 mana, so the only card you can ever Cascade into is Living End. So the idea with this deck is that basically the entire deck is made up of expensive creatures that have cycling. So in other words, the Cascade spells skip these cards, but you can still use them to cycle into your important land drops and combo pieces. And then once you're ready, you Cascade into Living End, you put them all back into the battlefield, and you win the game.
Meanwhile, Bradley Rosenberry on Elves over on the other side of the table, a favorite of a lot of players. And playing that arena promo elf there, no big deal. Looks like he won some matches in the Pauper event.
Yeah, Elves is one of my favorite decks. Sadly, I have to say that Living End is probably the worst imaginable matchup for Elves because it's a fast combo deck that you have to race, and every Living End represents an instant speed Wrath of God, or often instant speed Wrath of God that's just going to kill all of your Elves. So Bradley with, an amazing start here. 5 creatures in play on the second turn. That's nothing to sneeze at, but Angelescu's deck is very, very, very well equipped to deal with this because all he needs to have is a Cascade spell. He's going to hit Living End, wipe all these Elves off the battlefield.
All right, so here we go.
So here we're going to see Angelescu Cascade through much of his library until he finds Living End. Remember, that's the only thing he can hit, the way he's constructed his deck. He's going to cast that. He might even respond by cycling more creatures like Street Wraith or Fairy Macabre, and then he's going to return 3 or more creatures to the battlefield in addition to killing all of his opponent's cards. So we're seeing both decks with great draws, just performing exactly how their pilots drew it up, but Living End with the trump strategy in this particular matchup.
Geez, I was going to say, where is it? Pretty far down, but there, in fact, is Living End. Cost 0, so we're going to get to cast it here. Do you want to take a look, Bradley? Read 'em and weep. All of your Elves, not long for this world.
Bradley pausing on another card that the Elf deck probably does not want to see on the battlefield, Archfiend of Ifnir. That's a relatively new addition to this Living End deck and a really sweet one.
I love Archfiend of Ifnir. Such a derpy-looking dragon. But my other favorite part about Living End is all the dumb creatures it puts into play. Like, here's some Desert Ceradons and a Horror of the Broken Lands. Oh, okay. Good enough, though. As long as they've got cycling, they're in the deck.
All right, so this is going to be a minimum of an attack for 16. It only takes 2 cycles for the Horror of the Broken Lands to wind up being lethal here.
And, some people might be wondering, should Elves play more conservatively because, in living in fear of Living End, that sort of thing. But in reality, you've just got to put your foot on the gas and pray. Is that the deal, Reed?
Yeah, well said. Modern is not really a play conservatively type of format. It's more of a just play as fast as you can and hope your opponent doesn't have the right card to stop you. And I think Bradley did exactly what he was supposed to do this game, which is put Jonathan Angelescu to the test of, do you have the Living End, do you have the 3rd land and the Cascade spell? And unfortunately he had it, but you give yourself the best chance that way.
So Jonathan Angelescu up a game here over Bradley Rosenberry. Both players starting off their tournament 2-0. Living End versus Elves. We're going to kick things off cycling this Street Wraith. Angelescu down to 18.
Jonathan Angelescu, for those of you at home who don't know him, he's a player from Germany who excels on Magic Online and in particular in Eternal formats, legacy specialist, but here making the trip to Oakland, California to play some Modern.
All right, are we playing Death Shadow or what? 3 Street Wraiths in the bin here on turn 1 for Jonathan. Life total down to 14 after that. Blackcleave Cliffs here. Passes back over to Bradley. who has a Llanowar Elves in play. And we're just going to keep building up the board. There's a Heritage Druid.
Wow, amazingly explosive draw for Rosenberry here. He can cast Dwynen's Elite, which will untap Nettle Sentinel, give him another crack at the Heritage Druid activation. He could cast something like Collected Company if he's got more action in hand.
That'd be sweet. Keeping track of the mana over there on the left side of your screen on the forest.
Wow, Maria, that's even better than Collected Company. That's Scavenging Ooze with, on turn 2, access to as much mana as he really wants. Rosenberry can decimate the graveyard of Jonathan Angelescu. Now, that's not it. That's not locking the Living End player out of the game, because remember, the first Living End will wrath the Elves player's board. But what it does mean is that Rosenberry won't be dead to the first Living End, because there will be a lot fewer creatures coming into play. So here we see the Elves player amassing quite a lot of power and toughness and a Scavenging Ooze to manage the graveyard of the Living End player. Angelescu needs to have Living End within the next 2 turns in order to just not die at face value. But then the game will be tricky and even, because the Elves player will have nothing in play, but we'll have a powerful graveyard. So I don't know how this game's going to play out. Either we're going to see Living End this turn off of Simian Spirit Guide, in which case Angelescu is going to be in really good shape. Or option 2 is that we're going to see Angelescu fail to find Living End and just die to the initial onslaught of Elves. Or option number 3, which is what I'm hoping for, is that Living End will come next turn, and then we're going to have a really close, fascinating game.
All right, there's Simian Spirit Guide as we kind of cycle through things here. Shriekmaw.
Secret option number 4, which is that Angelescu actually had a spot removal spell for Scavenging Ooze, so now the game's going to continue, and he'll have a couple more turns to set up a really powerful Living End.
All right, get on in there. Bradley Rosenberry swinging for the fences here.
And you've got to love the ingenuity of the Living End deck, choosing a card like Shriekmaw as a spot removal spell, which dodges the Cascade requirements, a 5-mana spell, technically, that you can actually cast for 2 mana.
You know, we've talked this morning a little bit about sometimes how sideboarding can be tricky in some of these decks that are more streamlined with their game plans, and that's a really interesting way to get around it.
Yeah, the Living End deck in particular, subject to some really, really steep deck building requirements, not able to play with any cards with a converted mana cost less than 3 mana.
Dwynen's Elite number 2, by the way, added to the team for Bradley. Jonathan Angelescu's life total down to 7 after that single attack. All right, everybody, get on in there, and Angelescu's got to scoop him up.
Crazy. So that's we talked about decks winning and losing in spectacular fashion sometimes in Modern. That was Jonathan Angelescu's Living End deck just not finding Living End, and then in that case, it really doesn't do much.
All right, here we go. Game number 3. Horror of the Broken Lands on the cycle for Angelescu here. I do see a Violent Outburst in hand. There's a Street Wraith. Llanowar Elves in play for Bradley, who, by the way, big props foiling out his deck. Love to see it. Street Wraith number 2. Jonathan down to 16.
All right, so this is the dream situation for Angelescu.
Oh, yeah.
He has an untapped land and a Simian Spirit Guide already with 3 creatures in the graveyard, and he can instant speed this Violent Outburst, which means he can pass the turn, and if Rosenberry has an explosive turn, he's actually going to go for it right away. This is a bit surprising to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, because now Bradley has the opportunity to play out more from his hand.
Yeah, I would have thought you go for it at the end of the turn to make sure that the Elves player is starting their turn 3 with nothing on the battlefield. Now, this is still a great situation for Angelescu. Don't get me wrong, he's going to have 3 creatures against 0 on turn 2. However, the Elves deck is powerful and explosive enough that if Rosenberry has a really, really great hand, he could still win this game simply by rebuilding over the course of 2 turns. It's difficult, but it's not impossible.
So there is Living End for Jonathan Angelescu. A couple of Street Wraiths and a Horror of the Broken Lands now in play. But here we go. Let's see if the Elves deck can build back up. If I'm Bradley, though, I'm just like, oh, does he have another one? There's Scavenging Ooze. By the way, this is Bradley's first Grand Prix. A swamp found here for Jonathan. Cycling party continues for Angelescu, and a big attack here from the Living End player.
Yep, remember that cycle does pump up Horror of the Broken Lands, so this representing an attack for at least 12.
Bradley sitting at 20 before this attack.
Your pairings for round 4
It's going to have to take it here.
are available online at pairings.channelfireball.com.
Down to 8 after that attack. Back over to the Elves player.
Are making their way to the pairing boards.
Looking pretty dire.
Please leave an aisle for judges.
Very
to get
dire.
To the pairings boards.
What he really needs is he needs Heritage Druid plus 2 more Elves so that he can pass the turn with blockers and mana to activate Scavenging Ooze, but he's got none of that.
No. Just an Assassin's Trophy. Attack in from Angelescu here.
So the best Rosenberry can do is block and double activate the Scavenging Ooze, but Angelescu close to lethal if he can cycle a few cards or perhaps use Beast Within to take out the Scavenging Ooze.
Here's the trophy targeting that Horror of the Broken Lands.
So a decent play from Rosenberry, but it does mean the Scavenging Ooze is going to die, and then what?
Yeah. Then what indeed? Land here, forest is found for Jonathan. One of the reasons I find the Living End deck so funny is not only because of the quote-unquote bad creatures that it plays, but sometimes if it can't win with its Living End condition, it just has to hard cast Street Wraiths and Desert Ceradons.
And we might even see a even more sort of techie off-the-wall play, which is Angelescu Beast Withinning one of his own lands just to produce a 3/3 creature.
Yeah. Bradley down to 5 now, following that block in the attack from Angelescu. Bradley attempting to stay alive here. Getting a couple of Elves down, but the writing appears to be on the wall. There's that Beast Within play you mentioned. We're going to take this swamp, turn it into a 3/3.
And this will force double chump blocks from Rosenberry, and from that position, there's basically going to be nothing the Elves player can do to get back into it.
Back over to Jonathan's turn. Simeon Spirit Guide the draw there.
You know that one's getting cast.
Yeah! Speaking of. And there's the double chump block from Bradley. Gonna go to 2. Land go from Angelescu over to Rosenberry. Clinging on for dear life here, but there's the Scavenging Ooze. It just wasn't a good matchup, but a cool showing from Living End there. Jonathan Angelescu taking down that match in pretty spectacular Living End fashion, as it always does, putting on a good show for us here at this Grand Prix.
Yeah, I expected that to be a tough one for the Elves player. He did manage to steal the middle game just by virtue of Angelescu not having Living End in time. But, you know, games 1 and 3,
Yeah.
the Wrath of God effect of Living End, just too brutal for the Elves decks.
All right, more Magic on the way here from Grand Prix Oakland. Coming up in just a second. We'll be right back.